How is your eyesight, folks? Have you got excellent 20/20 vision? Have you experienced sight loss or sight impairment due to any illnesses or conditions that you might have experienced? Or maybe you never had any good eyesight and you would be like me, join the club. Anyway, I decided to create this episode of Exploring Brain and Mind to raise more awareness and to hopefully get more understanding that the brain works different for visually impaired and people with sight loss. It is a topic that may spark curiosity, but it's not getting enough publicity, I think. So we are looking at how the brain perceives the world when traditional sight is impaired. And we're going to explore visual impairment not just as a condition, but as a unique lens through which to understand the amazing and incredible adaptability of our brain. To kick off the episode, the key question is, how does the brain perceive the world when traditional sight is impaired? And we're exploring visual impairment not just as a condition, but as a unique lens through which to understand how amazingly adaptable the human brain is. Before I go into how the brain might adjust with regards to different conditions and the different stages, let's look at the basics. How does a sighted brain see and how does it process visual information? It starts with light entering the eye, then it hits the retina and electrical signals are sent along the optic nerve to the brain. From there, it's a complex process involving multiple brain regions and primarily the visual cortex in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain is involved. This area is responsible for interpreting shapes and colors and motion and depth, and it allows us to construct our visual world. That's the very basics of how traditional eyesight works. Now let's move to visual impairment. What is visual impairment? It's crucial to understand that visual impairment and sight loss are broad terms. They include a wide spectrum of different conditions, from partial sight to complete blindness, and they can be present from birth or develop later in life. The brain's response varies significantly depending on the type, the onset and the severity of the impairment. If you listen to previous episodes, especially the one about neuroplasticity, you will remember that the brain is a very adaptable organ. It can adapt and adjust to new things. It can learn new things. It can unlearn old things. And in the context of visual impairment, this is where it gets really interesting, because it means it can reorganize itself, forming new neural connections and even taking over functions from damaged or underutilized areas. And this adaptability and plasticity is key to how people with visual impairment navigate the world. So let's look at what happens at so-called early onset blindness, which could be due to congenital reasons and at a very early stage in life. Cross-modal plasticity happens when the visual cortex doesn't receive typical visual input from birth. It doesn't just sit dormant, but instead it can be repurposed to process information from other senses like touch and hearing. Then we have the enhanced non-visual senses. And to have enhanced non-visual senses leads to often remarkable enhancements in auditory processing. For example, heightened ability to locate sounds and to differentiate audible sound cues. And it also enhances the tactile processing, for example, exceptional ability to read Braille or to discern textures and to navigate spaces through touch. There has been some research done. Studies using MRI technology have shown that the visual cortex of individuals blind from birth can become active when they are performing tasks like reading Braille, listening to sounds, or even remembering verbal information. It's like the brain saying, oh, well, I'm not getting any visual input. I've got other senses, other ways to get the data that I need. I have a great example as a specific condition here, which is albinism. That is what I've got too. There's two different kinds of albinism. You've got the occutaneous albinism that just affects the eyes, and then you've got the oculocutaneous albinism that affects eyes and skin. For individuals with albinism, the issue isn't typically complete blindness, but rather a lack of pigment in the eyes, which is crucial for normal vision development. And it's also important for the production of melanin, and melanin helps for creating pigments, i.e. people with albinism, with the oculocutaneous albinism, cannot tan. We only burn. We get pink like a little piglet, but we don't get really any kind of brown or other tan. So this lack of pigment for the normal vision development can lead to reduced visual acuity, sensitivity to light, photophobia, it's called with a technical term, nystagmus, which is another technical term, and nystagmus means that the eye involuntarily moves up to down or side to side. The brain does adjust. I don't see things flickering from side to side or from top to down. It was more extreme in younger years, but the brain has adjusted more over the years, I noticed. There is also sometimes optic nerve rerouting in these cases. The brain works to compensate the reduced and sometimes unstable visual input it receives. It learns to interpret less clear images and may rely more heavily on peripheral vision or develop strategies to manage light sensitively. The brain is still trying to make sense of the visual world, but it's doing so with a compromised sensory input pathway. I can share a bit of own experiences here. I work a lot with sound, with memory. I memorize how things work, the steps I need to do something. And instead of looking at things to do them, I do them by memory. Sometimes I do them by audio instructions. When I go out, I get issues with sunlight coming straight from the front. Or at nighttime, it is like when I'm walking along a road and the cars come with their bright headlights. That can cause me problems as well. I can't necessarily see what's anything that I need to watch out for. In familiar settings, in an area where I know where to go, I use my memory again. I don't need to watch where I'm going. Well, I do need to watch where I'm going, obviously, when it comes to traffic and stuff like that. But I use sound and the audible capacity, so to speak, a lot when it comes to watching traffic. And for crossing at places with traffic lights, there are also little cones or devices at the lights that help crossing roads, especially if the light causes any kind of problems. When I have to go to new places, I have to research very carefully where I'm going. Everything moves a lot slower then because I have to kind of try and memorize what I'm doing, where I'm going. When it comes to keeping the place clean, that's where touch comes a bit more into play because I can't necessarily see if something is dirty. If there is a kind of discoloring kind of thing, if there's spilled coffee or something on a bright surface, I might notice that. But if there is dust, if there's a lot of dust, or if there's any kind of not that easily visible dirt or stuff, then I might miss that if I don't use touch. So using other senses plays a massive role in everyday life, and it might create mental struggles as well sometimes that are not visible to the outside. And that's why I think that people with visual impairment or sight loss are perceived very often as not very disabled, or you can manage, and it gives the wrong impression. It can easily give the wrong impression if we're not using any kind of aids like assistance dog, the white cane, or anyone who's walking with us or holding on to us. So let's go back to topic and see what happens within the brain at acquired blindness, which means like when the sight gets lost later in life. When the sight is lost in later life, the brain has already been wired for visual processing, but there is an initial period of significant adjustment that will have to take place because the brain can't do the processing as it used to. While some cross-modal plasticity can occur, cross-modal plasticity was mentioned earlier, it is generally less extensive than in early onset blindness, as the visual cortex has already established the strong visual pathways, which means then that there will be more reliance on memory and existing knowledge, as in individuals using more of their existing visual memories and the established spatial understanding of the world. Rehabilitation and training are important at that stage when sight loss happens. Targeted rehabilitation, like learning to use a white cane or braille, helps the brain adapt and develop new strategies for navigation and information capabilities. And as a specific condition, I'm looking here at sudden blindness, for example, due to stroke or to optic neuritis. When blindness occurs very suddenly, the brain is thrown into an abrupt state of sensory deprivation. That is very often a period of significant disorientation and distress. The brain will still retain the visual memories, but it must rapidly shift its reliance on other senses. For example, in case of optic neuritis, where the optic nerve is inflamed, vision can be temporarily or permanently lost. The brain, having been previously sighted, attempts to interpret the lack of signal from the optic nerve, sometimes leading to perceived flashes of light, which is called phosphenes, as it tries to make sense of the absent input. So the brain is essentially leading with a sudden disconnect in its primary visual input pathway. Let's look at partial sight or low vision next, with some things maybe popping up again that we might have touched on already. So for individuals with partial sight, the brain works harder to make sense of the limited or distorted visual information it receives. This can mean that more cognitive effort is expended to interpret visual cues. The brain might also prioritize certain types of visual information, some things that it might already know. For example, motion over the detail, and that can depend on specific conditions because there might be differences. And it also involves integrating other senses, like with blindness, where other senses play a more crucial role in filling the gaps and providing content. How does this look like for conditions like macular degeneration? Where central vision is lost, but peripheral vision remains, the brain adapts by relying more on peripheral cues and often developing strategies to use the remaining vision effectively. This means the brain is constantly remapping its focus to the intact peripheral field which isn't typically used for detailed tasks like reading. What could it mean for conditions like a glaucoma, where peripheral vision is often lost first? Individuals might develop strategies to scan their environment more actively to compensate for the narrowed visual field. The brain essentially learns to piece together a coherent picture from a much smaller window of information. So for this part, I have two different specific conditions to look at. And the first one of this is retinitis pigmentosa, also abbreviated as RP. So RP is a group of genetic disorders that cause progressive degeneration of the photoreceptor cells, which are the rods and the cones in the retina. This typically starts with night blindness and then leads to tunnel vision as peripheral vision is gradually lost. The brain of individuals with RP experiences a slow and continuous decline in the quality and quantity of visual input. It adapts by increasingly relying on the diminishing central vision. And as the visual field constricts, it activates other senses more intensely for navigation and awareness. The brain must constantly adjust its internal map of the world as the visual information changes. The next condition we're looking at is the cortical visual impairment, or CVI. This is a fascinating and often misunderstood condition because the eyes themselves are healthy. Instead, CVI is caused by damage to the parts of the brain that process visual information, which would be the visual cortex or the pathways leading to it. This means the brain receives the signals from the eyes but struggles to interpret them. The brain's challenge here is not about a lack of input, but a processing deficit. Individuals with CVI might experience inconsistent vision, prefer certain colors or moving objects, struggle with visual clutter, or experiencing difficulties recognizing faces, even if they can see details. The brain may prioritize certain visual features. It can interpret and use compressing strategies that involve heavy reliance on touch, sound, and even memory to make sense of their surroundings. What is it about the mind's eye, about mental imagery and spatial representation? We're looking at this because it is a common misconception that people who are blind don't see, in quotes, in their minds. The concept of a mind's eye is complex. Even in individuals that are blind from birth, the brain develops rich spatial maps of their environment based on touch and sound. They can navigate complex spaces, understand relationships between objects, and form detailed mental representations. These representations might not be visual in the same way as a sighted person's representations are, but they are equally valid and effective. Research suggests that people who are blind can still form mental images, although the content and sensory modality of these images may differ. For someone blind from birth, imaging a cup might evoke tactile sensations of holding it, the sound of liquid pouring, or even a sense of the weight and temperature, rather than having a visual picture of a cup. People who are blind from birth also often report dreams that are rich in sound, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations rather than visual imagery. Those who become blind later in life may continue to have visual dreams, which gradually become less frequent or vivid over time. What could the future hold for people with sight loss or visual impairment? The field of assistive technology is rapidly advancing, offering exciting possibilities for the future. Sensory substitution devices like the brain port, which translates visual information into tactile sensations on the tongue, or the device called Orcam My Eye, which audibly describes the environment, are examples of how we can feed information to the brain through alternative sensory pathways, leveraging its plasticity. For certain conditions, bionic eyes or retinal implants could be used. These implants can bypass damaged parts of the eye and directly stimulate the optic nerve or visual cortex, offering a form of artificial sight. While the visual input is often rudimentary, for example, light and shadow, the brain can learn to interpret these new signals. And then there's the brain-computer interface, the BCIs. Direct interfaces with the brain could potentially provide rich sensory information directly to the visual cortex, offering new avenues for perception of those with severe visual impairment. Something I didn't find in this list of any kind of future developments was, are there not implants yet with regards to helping people to get vision? And those implants would be for blind people. I have to do more research on this one. I know I've heard about other brain implants, but that's a bit, over tricky avenue. So I leave that out. And to conclude on the subject, the journey of understanding the brain's response to visual impairment is a powerful testament to its incredible resilience and adaptability. It challenges our assumptions about how we see the world and highlight the profound interconnectedness or interconnections between our senses and our cognitive abilities. By exploring these unique experiences, we get some deeper insights into the fundamental workings of the human brain and mind. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. As usual, please like and share the episode with someone who might benefit from it. Maybe if you've got people in your circles that need more awareness about how the world might work for someone with sight loss or visual impairment, share the episode with them to raise more awareness. Follow and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube. And tune in again to the next episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. Thank you for listening.